Good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and this is our May 5th Cinco de Mayo meeting. Welcome, everyone. We're allowing everybody to run into our participation via Zoom. We've got 26 attendees and more coming in. While we allow folks to Zoom in, we can start with a roll call.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner Hackett.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Great. Well, welcome, everybody. It's good to see all your faces again. We have a general session set up for today. We will take public comment. We have a report from the Executive Director's Office of Colorado Department of Natural Resources, a report from the Director of the COGCC, and then staff will present on Financial Assurance Information Docket sort of update. So with that, Hearings Manager Larson, I believe we will start with general public comment. I think we had 13 people signed up, and I think that Mr. Tim Burns was first, and I think I saw that he made it into our meeting.
You are correct.
And for the general public comment, a reminder, everyone has 3 minutes to present to us. I will be keeping time. Once your 3 minutes is up, I will indicate time is up, and we would ask that you try to wrap up. So we look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Should we go?
Yes, Mr. Burns, we can hear you, and you are set.
Okay. Thank you for providing this forum for me to communicate my concerns with operations at the accidental drilling sites Yellowhammer, Papa Joe, and May J that are located just north of CR10 and just east of CR3. My name is Tim Burns. I live at 504 Leo Drive in the Colliers Hill development in Erie. I'm approximately 2,000 feet south of the accidental sites. 2 weeks ago, we became aware of loud noise at night. That was obviously coming from the accidental operations. Since we have moved in Colliers Hill, it has been extremely quiet at night to the point where the racetrack noises on the other side of I-25, a few miles away, are really noticeable on the weekends. I filed noise complaints through the COGCC portal, both overnight Friday morning around 3:30 a.m. on 4/23, when I was first awakened by this noise in the middle of the night, and then again late Friday night around 10:30 p.m. also on 4/23. I also sent an email to the Erie Board of Trustees directly afterwards, complaining of the noise. I included a brief video clip recorded from my patio, as well as a screenshot of a 30-second record of the noise levels using a phone app that I downloaded that showed the active noise source exceeding what is the 50 decibel limit here in Erie for noise at nighttime. On Wednesday morning, 4/28, I did receive a call from the COGCC representative, Mr. Silver, about my complaints. He did advise that he had measured the noise and had found it to be within their requirements. I asked where these measurements occurred, and he stated it was about 350 feet from the site. I told him that I had measured several locations on 4/23 in the evening, approximately 10 p.m., including from the CR10 shoulder directly south of the Yellowhammer and Papa Joe pads, on Pine Cliff Drive, that's approximately 1,000 feet from the pads, and on my back patio. And that while the readings I obtained at my house were louder than what I had obtained on CR10, Mr. Silver had mentioned that's about the 350-foot distance. He acknowledged that the sound levels could be louder based on terrain, but that he was only concerned about the 350-foot distance. He also mentioned that the equipment responsible for the noise would be removed within a week, which would end the noise nuisance anyway. These responses appear to be more to placate my concerns than address and resolve. And I get it. I have worked in highway and heavy construction for nearly 30 years, and I have acted as one of the primary contacts for stakeholder concerns and complaints. But acknowledging there was a noise issue, but not addressing these beyond just telling me to wait it out a week is not really a great sign going forward with these operations. While it's unpleasant, the noise levels my family and neighbors have experienced are not even the primary concern that many in my community have with these operations so close to our development. The risks to the people who have to live near these sites are predominantly air pollution from the toxic gases and VOCs and chemical exposure specifically for pregnant women and for children. I myself have an immunocompromised toddler, and I have significant concerns about whether it's safe for anyone, much less my little girl, to be able to play in our own backyard, much less the neighborhood parks. A fair number of neighbors have been vocal about how the COGCC has been ineffective responsive to or even dismissive of complaints. Does not make me feel as if the commission is really interested in being the oversight to these operations as much as protecting. As these 3 sites move to the flowback and production stages, I want to be assured that the commission will be responsive to our concerns and not dismissive. As we move beyond the noise nuisance into actual health hazards, we need advocates for us, the stakeholders, and not just the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. And I would suggest that you reach out to Mike Leonard, a COGCC employee who's in charge of the complaint areas. He is listening in to your comments today, and he can be reached via his contact information on our website.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yep, thank you. Ms. Larson, who do we have next?
Mr. Chair, next we have Cody Perry. Mr. Chair, we are just going through and checking for Mr. Perry, so give us one moment.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, we're not finding Mr. Perry. He had been there for a moment and he's disappeared. We will keep looking for him. We can move on to Heidi Lethwood.
Ms. Lethwood, you are muted.
Hi, good morning, commissioners. I'm not very prepared today and I'm not good off the cuff, so I apologize and might be rambling. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about myself today, since you know I'm going to come here and say I'd like you to phase out fracking by 10% each year and new permits and gradually close the old wells. But I just wanted you to know that, no offense, but I really wish I wasn't here. I really wish I still didn't know what the COGCC is. I'm giving up a successful career. I'm a musician. I've given world premieres with living composers. And in fact, I have a new CD coming out with some world premiere recordings that I recorded a few years ago with a colleague. I also am a trainer of teachers of a coordination movement education method that's not very well known, and there are only 30 of these training courses in the US, and I'm phasing that out for the reason that 3 years ago, the IPCC report came out detailing how we're all affected by climate change right now. And if we don't keep emissions under, if we don't keep warming from under 1.5 degrees Celsius, my children face a future, an uncertain future, not just due to the climate changes themselves, but due to the political instability that will happen from all the climate migration. And I became terrified. I'm letting go of my jobs. I'm privileged to be able to do that because my husband works full time, but I'm sure he's not very happy about that. And I've become a climate activist. I never thought I would ever do this. I've been one of the people with my head in the sand for years and years, but I can no longer sit quietly by the sidelines. And that's why you see me every week. I wish that you didn't know who I was either. And I know that the COGCC has to just go by tiny little detailed approaches, just looking at little rules, hundreds of little rules. But I beg you to look at the big picture and consider cumulative emissions and consider what you can do to help with the climate emergency that our world is facing. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us this morning and for your comments. Do we have Shayna Oliver, Ms. Larson? She's next on our sign-up sheet.
Yes, we do. We will bring her in.
Hello.
Good morning, Ms. Oliver. We see you and we can hear you.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing public comment this morning. My name is Shayna Oliver. As well as I want to also acknowledge that we are on stolen lands of the directly Cheyenne and Arapaho, as well as the Ute nations, as well as 45 other tribes that ancestrally once occupied the state of Colorado. I am a Northeast community member of Denver. I'm a field organizer, an indigenous people's advocate for our rights, as well as being a field organizer with Eco Madres Moms Clean Air Force Colorado. And it's a national organization of mothers, dads, and caregivers united in fighting for children's right to breathe and play in a safe environment and free from harmful impacts on their health. Colorado was 10th worst state for poor air quality, for ground ozone pollution, according to the State of the Air report by the American Lung Association. This year's State of the Air report, we finally moved it up from a 10th place to 8th place for poor air quality, pushing us into indefinitely serious non-attainment, according to the EPA for regional haze. So most importantly, I am an Indigenous mother of 4. We are the descendants of the genocide. The government pushed on to Indigenous people and pushed forward the Indian Removal Act in order to steal Indigenous lands for stolen resources that you heavily rely on as your economic status that you are playing with, and continue to play with people's health and well-being. These are long, historic type of policies and violations that have impacted Indigenous people, community, health, wealth, and environmental well-being. And it should be not taken lightly to just allow industries to keep coming in on newly developed neighborhoods, newly developed houses. These new neighborhoods, these new neighbors of ours didn't ask to be next to oil and gas, didn't ask to be harmed by air toxics, didn't ask to have an unsafe environment for their children to play in their backyards. They didn't ask for that when they came to Colorado, nor did Colorado advertise this to them when they came to Colorado. So I really hope that you take leadership in protecting health and environment as your mission states, and conservation of Colorado resources and land. And I think your department needs to reimagine what Colorado actually needs. And it's not oil and gas being exported to India firms or China firms or Canadian firms that are buying up oil and gas in Colorado. And those monies is not staying in our state, and it's not benefiting our communities or our state. And having a reliancy on this industry will have drastic economic impacts on health and environmental well-being if you continue to ignore what you're supposed to be doing, is protecting the health and environment of all our communities, not just the few. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Oliver. I believe we now have Patricia Nelson.
Yes.
Good morning. Before I start, I just wanted to tell you guys, Rhonda wanted me to let you know that she wouldn't be here today because she had a dental emergency. She has signed up for public comment though.
Thank you for letting us know, Ms. Nelson.
So I've been coming to testify at COGCC hearings for years. And through my experience and every time I've come to testify, we've always been telling you guys what's going on in our communities. We've always been telling you about all of our experiences. You have hundreds at this point, hundreds of mothers coming in telling you that their kids are experiencing nosebleeds, that they're taking to the doctor and the doctor can't tell them what's wrong with their child. I don't know if any of you guys have kids, but that's terrifying. But what I really wanted to do here today is to come here to ask you questions. I want to kind of start that conversation between us because I don't think that's ever really happened in the last 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this. And so, you know, what I really want to know what this commission is going to do differently, because y'all have been in your position for about a year now and nothing has changed. You guys are no longer a volunteer commission. You guys are now being paid. And so what I wanted to ask you guys today is, what do you guys want your legacy to be? A quick Google search will tell you that a well will produce between 20 to 40 years. So every time you guys come in, clock in, or whatever you have to do, and you're approving permits, you are all setting up your legacy for the next 20 to 40 years. And every time you approve another permit, you are impacting communities like mine. And we're going to remember that. And I can tell you right now that my son is going to remember that, because he has missed so much time with me because I'm spending my days and my afternoons and my weekends and my summers trying to talk to you guys, trying to let you know what's actually happening in our community. And again, I want you guys to remember this, like, what is your legacy going to be? You guys are approving permits that are going to impact our communities for decades to come. When you have companies like Extraction Oil and Gas posting on their Facebook that they have a good 5 to 10 years in Weld County, 5 to 10 years. You guys have, I don't see anywhere where I can find a plan of what's going to happen to all those wells that are producing, because they have a good 5 to 10 years and they've already declared bankruptcy. So who knows if they're even going to make it that long. I know I only have about 30 seconds left, but I want to take those 30 seconds to invite you guys to my community, because in Weld County, we have the majority of the active wells in our state, and we're producing the majority of the oil and gas in our state. And I want you guys to come, because I've never seen any representatives from the COGCC come to my community and actually see what their work is doing to my community. So anytime you guys want, I'm sure a lot of you already have my information and know who I am. So please let me know when you guys want to come see what y'all are doing. I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. We appreciate your comments, and we may try to take you up on that. And I appreciate that you've self-timed yourself. I just don't think I've seen another public commenter do that, so that's very helpful. And thank you for spending time with us and giving us that perspective. So thank you for being with us. I think we now have Harmony Cummins.
Good morning. My name is Harmony Cummings, and I spent 8 years working in oil and gas. I've been to scores of fracking sites with so much gas flaring off it looks like a war zone on indigenous lands in North Dakota. I've been on crude oil loading sites in Weld County, and I've been in the poison sugar fields of Louisiana. What we're doing to these communities is terrible. But on top of that, why we're doing them is even worse. It was my job to calculate profits for oil and gas traders. The guys that I worked for on average were making $2 to $3 million a month. One person making $2 to $3 million a month. On some of the peak months, $12 million. $12 million to one person off of the backs, the lungs, the bloody noses, the unknown sicknesses, cancers, and deaths of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. What are we even talking about? I'm looking at every single one of you up here. When is this enough? Do you hear these mothers out here? Again, do you have children? Is this what you would want for them? Because this is bullshit and it is unfair. How long do you want this to continue? Because it's not just the producers. It's the producers, it's the pipelines, the storage, the railroads, the utilities, the refineries, the end users, lots and lots of people making millions and millions and millions of dollars while other people suffer and die. Is this who you want to be? I don't even know what else to say. Go see Patricia's school. Is this where you want your kids to go to school, where her kids have to go to school? Extraction Energy, those guys, oh my gosh. They just won an award last year from the Denver Business Journal, and then came out and told them that Jared Polis said that they were such a great company that he wishes that they were all like them. Those guys who filed bankruptcy, paid millions of dollars to their top executives, then filed bankruptcy, then laid off 30% of their employees last year during the pandemic. These are the things we want to continue to support. These are not who I want to be. Is this who you want to be? Please do something different before it's too late. And may the harms that come onto these communities come back onto you if you don't do anything to help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cummings. I believe we now have Marie Venner.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Venner, we can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. I want to echo all of the moms who spoke before me. Really profound words. Thanks for listening to Coloradans this morning. And I trust that in the future, you're going to start truly listening to us and incorporating this in your work. I have faith in you. Thank you for extending the invitation last week to be in touch and emphasizing that you are available and ready to listen to and work with the public. I'm wondering if after my time speaking, if each of you might tell us what the distribution of your daily time looks like. This would probably help us better understand where you are in your work and knowledge. I'm from a rural ag family on one side, and my dad, brother, and many of whom I've spent my career working with are engineers in infrastructure. I have a background in cost-benefit analysis for the public sector. Oil and gas is an industry that is way off in that department because we can't discount our kids, grandkids, and future generations. When a private extractive entity takes land and water and ruins it for a long period or nearly forever in some cases, think of the injected water and in an arid environment, that's an extreme problem. Last week we heard from a restoration expert. That's a consolation. Did she share or do you know the proportion of drilled sites in Colorado that look like the pictures she shared? That is essential to know, and I would like you to share that with us. Speaking from a coalition of long-term Colorado small business owners, we are looking at an industry here with low accountability and high damage for our state. Likewise, the COGCC is not requiring of drillers what it would take to fully cover and close sites and bring them to full restoration. That full charge, at least $270K on average, should be deposited in a state fund before they start. And you should go back and get that from every driller now. This game that has been allowed of passing off and effectively disposing of responsibilities is grossly negligent and actively harms public health and safety. It must be remedied, and it's your job. Finally, plus is not the same as minus. The state has a commitment in law signed 2 years ago to reduce existing CO2 emissions and existing methane emissions by 26% by 2025. That's about 3.5 years from now. You are responsible for ensuring that. You and Coloradans you serve and are responsible for delivering this to will not get there by 2025 by only dealing with new drilling permits, though a moratorium on new permits until you get this under control would make sense. It's time to get that job done. I would ask you to meet and confer on this within the next week and get back to us on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Spinner. I believe we now have Guillermo Serna.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. You know, one of the things that we have to understand is that we're not talking to each other and we're not listening to each other. What was once new back in the 1900s, early 1900s with oil, it was a great thing. But anything that's new gets to be old and it's put aside. You have, and it's not easy for you to hear us because you can't speak back because of the time. The governor doesn't get the right information from its communities because he's not communicating. He put you up in front. And it's not easy for us to communicate with you because you're supposed to be talking and asking questions as to what is really happening. But I don't hear the trust in science. Every time that we question something in the past and in the present and probably in the future, we don't communicate with each other. We're always destroying things since the 13 colonies, since Columbus got here. We destroy things and don't put them back the way they are. People have suffered in conquering this whole nation. We have gone to other places and destroyed their grounds just for soil, just for oil. Now, if you're going to do something that is going to be worthwhile, is get the science, okay? Get the people with the science to talk to you people that are representing Colorado in their difficulties right now. I don't see you talking to them in any perspective. We're always counting each other instead of working together. We have to look at back east. There's 1 or 2 states now that are looking at eliminating oil. We know that it's going to end, but we're not looking at that. We need more energy, and it's not gas and oil. As long as the sun and wind and water is there, we should have enough for all without destroying Mother Nature, Earth. I hope that you're hearing me right now because I want you to succeed, but you cannot succeed if, like the lady that talked and the other lady, they know that you're not coming to their communities. You listen to the oil companies, but you don't listen to the people that are talking to you because you have so much on your plate. You're not enough to really look at the whole state of Colorado. So I ask of you, please Think about that. What is now old needs to be worked with on both sides of the line on how to do it better and how to eliminate, like we eliminated the buffalo, like
Mr.
we
Cerna, your
eliminated.
time is up. If you could wrap up, please.
Thank you. But I'm hoping that you understand the community. I don't have high college level, okay? I graduated from high school, but I was taught history. I was taught what happened. We have been destroying nations and people, but yet we want to send an example that we care for our people. Thank you very much. I hope you're well, and be patient with us, but please give us some answers.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Cerna.
you.
I believe we now have Rene Millard Shakan.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Shakan, we can hear you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. ¿Cuál es la netzi? How much do you need to see your work and responsibility from seeing the locations, asking the questions, and being more transparent with movement for the people in mind, not continue to neglect for whole communities? Today, we were read for missing and murdered Indigenous women, people, and children killed by predators, protected for further exploitation for generations, and impacted by extractive industries. Every time you pass these permits, there's blood in your profits. Our health is not something to compromise on for the sake of conceding for your economic benefit. You truly have already shown the community that you are no experts on our health for generations, but you'll find any benefit to exploit for economic backing. This is environmental racism and targeting, but ultimately a policy-making blind spot for our communities when it comes to authentic justice. How immoral and degrading it has become time and time again to have to compare our health benefits compared to your economic benefits when we suffer from so many disgusting forms of harm you know that's being caused by this particulate pollution. In fact, this past weekend, I was almost hospitalized for an anemic seizure. Understanding restorative justice is knowing where your system has become designed to cause harm for the sake of exploitation and has further become a barrier to our authentic justice. I honestly ask you now, you don't need to protect your polluters anymore. We already know that you are. We're asking you now to no longer protect them and to understand that you've created a whole entire system that no longer includes us, but has neglected and erased us and has made us completely invisible, no matter what scientific evidence that we've showed you has legitimately caused us harm for generations. We know that you're failing us, and this isn't a system that's broken, but is purely working as designed. We are no longer asking. We're telling you to do your jobs. It means that it does mean transparency, monitoring, and redistribution of wealth by the corporations that we know are harming us. We should have never been harmed on our homelands. And most of all, don't ever forget, you live on the land of the Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Jicarilla, Apache, Navajo, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, and 48 tribes that still travel through Denver. We will never leave. And we will be here to remind you what a good ancestor is for our resources, whether you listen to us or not. But we are telling you that we're dying, and it is not funny anymore after COVID. If you're being paid to do your jobs, do them better than you are. I'm honestly tired also of sitting here constantly being taken away from my children, being taken away even my students as a teacher, and being taken away even my community and praying. It has been enough through COVID, but to have to constantly sit on here and tell you the harm that is physically being caused from my children getting nosebleeds, severe asthma developing, and more. How can you sit there with just saying as though there's nothing going on? That's enough. Enough is enough. You need to be able to have the moral courage to stand up for future generations. And we're telling you because of the failing of past generations. I ask you to do this because that's what the living ancestor is. Most of all, I ask you to move forward in understanding that extractive industries are a form of targeting practices of white supremacy and predatory capitalism, favoring some while harming those most at risk. We need you to understand that pain is inevitable, but allowing suffering without protection is optional. And even in this space, BIPOC communities have survived resiliency, but it should be in front of any leadership, of any future climate policy and rulemaking to reimagine something new from those that have continually targeted us. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Next is Barbara Mills-Bria.
All right, can you hear me and see me?
We can hear you and we see you. Thank you.
So I'm a retired structural engineer. I worked in hydropower for 34 years. And I just wanted to address your April 28th meeting where you called on Commissioner Hackett to educate us ignorant public on the whistleblower issue and the fact that, hey, it wasn't us, it was those guys over there. And probably you were thinking, gosh, we dodged a bullet. But here in the general public, we have watched the air quality continue to degrade. And yes, we get it's not your job, it's those guys. But we are scratching our heads and wondering why you can't see the link between the emissions from all of the wells functioning or abandoned and the air quality. In the 2 years since 181, 1261 and 96 were passed, there's still no continuous monitoring of the monstrous well pads poisoning neighborhoods. You count on the industry who often says, oh yeah, we can and are doing better, but we can't do it if it's too expensive, to tell you how much they are emitting. And you stubbornly refuse to consider cumulative impacts. So if one well meets your lax standards, that's great. And then this one over here does too, that's fine. But what about the hundreds of wells together? We all get that DNR and CDPHE are separate agencies. What we don't get is why you can't work together as one state, the state of Colorado, to protect the citizens. You, not CDPHE, have approved over 4,000 wells since Polis was elected, over 3/4 of these since 181, 1261, and 96 were signed into law. And you still want to distance yourselves from those whistleblowers instead of acknowledging that both agencies are responsible for the polluted air, soil, and water. What we would like to see is the air quality folks, CDPHE, and the oil and gas folks, you guys, working together for the citizens of Colorado. And we're trying to understand why there is such a concerted effort not to act to improve air quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mills-Bria. We now will hear from Christy Douglas.
Thank you. I've just found out I was unmuted. Let me take a deep breath here. Listening to everyone else speak this morning has, wow, what powerful speakers. I can't thank any of them enough for coming out and speaking this morning. Thank you, commissioners, for hearing me out once again this morning. My name is Christy Douglas. I'm a wife, a mother, a grandmother to 5 beautiful grandchildren, and that's why I do this. I'm a racial and social justice activist, and today my focus is on environmental justice. I'm also an active community member, and I'm proud to be from Commerce City in Adams County. I also serve as the co-chair for the North Range Concerned Citizens, this volunteer group of neighbors who care about each other and our community. So, my husband and I took a little tour of just north of us in Commerce City, the Brighton area, Adams County. And I'd like to thank you for pushing through the nearly 3,000 permits by the January 15th, 2020 deadline, because the oil and gas industry is booming in Brighton and Adams County. So with that, and I think it's funny that there have been so many other speakers asking questions of you today, because I also have some questions for all of you. Why should my family and my neighbors' families have to live in fear for our health and safety just so someone who is probably already wealthy, at least by my standards, how they can add more to their own wealth by exploiting my communities? Why should we have to sacrifice for the comfort of others? And then to hear from somebody who worked in the industry how much people are making off of our backs, it floored me. So my next question is, what would you do if you were me? I hope you take that seriously. Wouldn't you question how the fact that there is whistleblowing at the CDPHE, wouldn't you question how that might impact current oil and gas operations in our communities?
Ms. Douglas, your time is up.
No one was insisting, I will finish up, no one was insinuating, as you said last meeting, that the COGCC had anything to do with the possible corruption at the CDPHE. I understand your concern, but it seems to be more about the implications rather than concern for whether the whistleblowing investigation will reveal possible dangerous and damaging impacts to our communities. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for being with us and speaking. We now have Tess Daughtery.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Ms. Daughtery.
Alrighty. Thank you, Commission, for allowing me to speak today. I'd like to discuss the contract renewal for Suncor, a company that has a long history of negligence, wrongdoing, and criminal behavior. And I'd like to acknowledge first that we reside on the stolen land of 48 indigenous tribes, which include the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne. The legacy of white genocidal colonizers who for over 500 years have still occupied these lands, and look at the results. The irreversible damage done to our environment, quality of life, and changing climate by for-profit, multi-billion-dollar energy corporations has significantly been pushed under the rug, ignored, and permitted to continue without accountability or safeguards instituted to prevent future damage that compounds the life-sucking harm they have already done. Even with a degree of regulatory standards and intervention in place, the government's role in safeguarding the public has never matched the compounding negative climate, health, and quality of life consequences that are the result of these companies' business practices. For 150 years, fossil fuel companies have largely gone unchecked, indeed have even been encouraged by government subsidies and then protected by government bailouts and allowed to expand, acquire, seize, and profit, even while fully aware of the documented, unquestionable, and long-known risks to human health, rising global temperature, and environmental degradation. In 150 years, we've done more climate damage than in the entire history of human existence on this planet. Many key issues identified in SB 181 were addressed in a thorough examination of the COGCC's rules, among them most relevant to this conversation. Establish new regulatory relationships with local governments, which includes COGCC involvement early on in local permitting and siting processes, and includes recognition that operators must comply with the most protective regulations. Ensure environmental justice for disproportionately impacted communities and allow them to be involved in the permit process. These are Colorado's first ever rules to be adopted and incorporate environmental justice as a consideration in facility siting. Don't tell us it's too expensive. Just yesterday, an article was published, released, that Suncor's first quarter profits of 2021 were higher than expected, to the tune of $821 million to be exact. Suncor CEO Mark Little, in a news release, was quoted saying this about their earnings. In the first quarter of 2021, we demonstrated our continued commitment to operational excellence through combined upgrader utilization, record production, and improved cost performance in the upstream. Energy Transfer, the pipeline company that works through Suncor, is a $90 billion company. We have been willfully ignorant. And what is sad is that we have the will to remain ignorant and to not take action, but not the will to change our current racist, reckless, rip-off Suncor refinery. It was recently reported that a difference—
Valerie, your time is up. If you could wrap up, please.
It was reported recently that a difference of 13 years exists for life expectancy, depending on where you live in the city. 13 years. And we're at a juncture where we have clear choices. Are we going to be on the right side of history and embrace a future with justice, health, and prosperity that we are getting a glimpse of? Or are we going to continue to choose redlining, bullying, environmental racism, corporate greed, fossil fuel grime, contaminated air, and eventually the loss of human lives? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dowdery. Now, the last speaker this morning is David Hagan.
Thank you. Thank you for hearing me today, board. My name is David Hagan. I live within a 5-mile radius of Suncor, and I would like you all to stop what's happening there. They need to close down. They need to stop moving forward. I know CDPHE is supposed to be the ones giving them the permit, but I'm sure your influence is something that can be used. At this point in time, after hearing Harmony and Tess and others talk about all the facts happening right now to people and the communities and the racism, I don't know how you could even think about doing anything but shutting these places down. The blood is on your hands for everybody that's had issues and died before now, but you have a chance to wash it off, or wash some of it off, by changing your actions now. You need to stop what is going on. You need to stop all of this. The community does not want this here. It's dangerous. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know how, like, at the end of the day, I'm going to lay down in my bed and I'm going to sleep just fine. I hope you can't sleep well if you're going to continue doing these things, because it's unfair. It's disgusting. The racism is absolutely disgusting. Right now they're fighting. Energy Partners has a pipeline through Byhalia they're trying to put in Memphis, which hopefully will not get put in the ground. But they're putting it through Boxtown, which is a previously freed people's, previously enslaved prop land. And it's been, passed down generation after generation. And that's the same shit that's going on here. Where is Suncor? It's in an area predominantly Black, brown, indigenous. It's not in an area where rich white people are. It's just one racist move after another. It is time to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hagan. Hearings Manager Larson, I think that gets through our list. I did not see that Mr. Perry ever showed up. Or is that accurate? Or we?
That is correct. We were not able to locate Mr. Perry. So we have gone through all the participants who signed up for public comment this morning.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone for your participation with us this morning. And we always appreciate listening to the public comment. At this time, we will move forward with our agenda, and we will have a report from the Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources Office. Commissioner Bill.
Thanks, Chair Robbins. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Angela Bogue, and I'm a policy advisor for climate change, forest health, and energy in the Colorado Department of Natural Resources Executive Director's Office. DNR Executive Director Dan Gibbs is attending a Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission meeting this morning, so he could not attend, but he wanted me to highlight some of the many efforts that are going on across DNR right now that may be of interest to the commissioners as well as to the public. So I just want to begin on the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that we all can't wait for this pandemic to be behind us and to get back to life without restrictions. And the good news is that we're starting to see some of the first clear signs of community level protection from vaccinations. COVID-19 case rates are highest where vaccination rates are the lowest and vice versa. And so being fully vaccinated means that you're at a much lower risk with most everyday interactions. But we also have to still be mindful of those who are not, including teenagers and children. And so during this transition period, as more people get vaccinated, the CDC has some very helpful guidelines around how you can mingle with vaccinated and unvaccinated people alike. So while most high-risk Coloradans are already vaccinated, we are starting to see a concerning rise in cases among children, especially among middle and high school students. And so while we wait for more vaccines to be approved for children under 16, we still need to rely on mask wearing, physical distancing, and healthy habits like hand washing to control spread among children. And in the midst of this, DNR is developing plans for our next steps to start the new normal planning, including meeting criteria for potential in-person meetings, a staggered return to offices, board and commission meetings like this one, and how we can balance keeping employees safe while supporting our customers. And field staff continue full operations at parks and wildlife areas, field inspections, water monitoring, and mine inspections. And the executive director's office is mapping our current facilities and staff and division requirements as we think about our needs in the future. And our continued goal is to be thoughtful to ensure solutions are sustainable and have a neutral or positive impact on employees as well as customer service and the ability for DNR to continue our mission. So moving on quickly to some legislative highlights, the General Assembly continues to operate in full swing. And while there was an initial goal of adjourning a bit early around Memorial Day, the session may go into June. There's a lot going on. And just to give you some highlights, DNR's top legislative priority is the creation of the Keep Colorado Wild Pass under SB 21-249, which was introduced in the Senate on April 23rd. And that bill is being scheduled to be heard tomorrow, May 6th, in the Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. And the Keep Colorado Wild Pass would reshape the way that our state parks are funded. It would increase access and conserve ecosystems and wildlife. The bill will create a reduced rate annual pass to Colorado's 42 state parks and recreation areas and other potential public lands. And it will also provide additional revenue to search and rescue efforts across the state. SB 21-245 is additional legislation introduced to address search and rescue. It will also be heard in the Senate Ag Committee on May 6th, and this bill, among other things, authorizes Colorado Parks and Wildlife to conduct a study and develop recommendations on issues related to backcountry search and rescue, including coordination among local, state, and nonprofit organizations. Moving on to SB 21-258, this is the wildfire risk mitigation stimulus package that was introduced last week. And this bill would deploy up to $25 million of state stimulus funding identified in the Colorado Recovery Plan to enhance wildfire mitigation efforts around the state, which is obviously a real focus after the 2020 wildfires last year. SB 21-237 would create a Forest Health Advisory Council within DNR. It passed the Senate on May 4th and now heads to the House. And this legislation modifies the existing Forest Health Advisory Council, again, bringing it into DNR to provide recommendations to the executive director of DNR and thereby the governor, as well as the state legislature. HB 21-1260, General Fund for Water Plan Funding. So this passed the House and will be heard in the Senate Ag Committee also tomorrow, May 6th. And this legislation allocates $20 million from the general fund to the Colorado Water Conservation Board to continue implementation of the state's water plan, again, as part of the Colorado Recovery Plan. And finally, HB 21-1226 is a bill to on check stations for aquatic nuisance species around the state. And it passed the House yesterday, May 4th, it passed the House, and yesterday it passed the Senate on second reading. And the bill directs the Division of Parks and Wildlife to investigate the methods that other states are using with respect to the location and operation of aquatic nuisance species check stations. So those are just some of our legislative highlights to share. And finally here, I'll share some highlights from several of DNR's divisions. So the Colorado Water Conservation Board staff have informed stakeholders of the first Water Equity Task Force meeting that will take place on May 18th. And if folks are interested in potentially attending that, there will be a public notice for that meeting going out this week. This meeting will be focused on input from the task force members, but will be open to the public for listening, and a public comment form is also available at engagecwcb.org. And the Water Equity Task Force was created to better understand existing equity, diversity, and inclusivity challenges in Colorado water issues and to inform the Colorado Water Plan. Moving on to the Mined Land Reclamation Board, they completed a 3-day hearing on the peak sand and gravel application, mine application off of Highway 9 in Summit County last week, and the board unanimously denied that permit, citing concerns with water and wildlife. Onto the State Land Board. In the March meeting, the State Land Board directed its staff to develop a plan for the strategic and responsible development of solar facilities on state trust lands that takes into account land stewardship, agricultural interests, and the state's renewable energy goals. And so staff will be presenting an update on the planning process at the May board meeting this month. And finally, just a quick update on the reintroduction of gray wolves, which is obviously an issue that has received a lot of public attention. Colorado Parks and Wildlife is continuing to make progress on the reintroduction, which they're required to do no later than December 31st, 2023. And just as a reminder, Colorado citizens voted Proposition 114 into statute in 2020, which directs the CPW Commission to develop a plan to restore and manage gray wolves in Colorado. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife has selected the Keystone Policy Center as the facilitation partner to help guide the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission in the upcoming public involvement process for gray wolf introduction efforts in the state. And so the CPW Commission will serve as the decision-making body for the development of the reintroduction plan, but will receive input from CPW staff, public stakeholders, and technical experts. And keep an ear open, because meetings will soon be held across the state to support plan development and collect input from the public. And a stakeholder advisory group, as well as a technical advisory group, are also being formed to serve as advisory bodies. So thanks so much. I know that was a lot, but Director Gibbs really wanted to make sure that, again, the commissioners and the public had an opportunity to hear about the many, many other things that are going on in DNR right now, and have an opportunity to get any relevant dates and have an opportunity to engage. So if you want any further information about any of the items that I shared, feel free to reach out. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bogue, for the extensive update on all things DNR. It's very much appreciated by our commissioners as well as our 68 attendees. So awesome. Great work. We now turn to Director Murphy. There is a slot for a report, and then we move directly into COGCC staff financial assurances and information docket.
Thank you, Chair. And if it's okay with you, I'll just give a quick update, which is that we're continuing on mission change rule implementation. We have a few permits in the queue that we're reviewing under the new rules now. It's exciting work. It's dynamic work. It's the implementation of all of the work that you all poured into our process through the fall to really shift how COGCC operates. In that vein, we have issued a new form around earthen pits, and we'll be working on guidance for that as well. And that really is a sum total of my operational side update. And with that, I would start sharing my screen and jump into the financial assurance update. And for context, I've been working with the commissioners and stakeholders over the course of the past weeks and months, and if some questions have kind of risen to the top as areas of further inquiry and places where we can provide a little bit more information. And so that's what I'm here to do today. Joel Miner will be joining to present some information as well. And without further ado, let me try to get everything working correctly. There we go. Okay, so the outline, again, there are some question and answers that I wanted to walk through to make sure that, we're kind of all starting on the same page in terms of information. And also staff spent a lot of time over the last few weeks putting together a robust amount of data and also conducting a literature review about emissions from inactive and orphan wells, as that's been a really important part of this conversation. There are a few outstanding questions I think that staff needs to continue to dig into, and also maybe we can call on some folks from industry to talk about their side of this work. And then I'd like to close out with kind of a suggested timeline for consideration. So with that, one of the important questions that comes up is, how does COGCC claim a bond? I think it's important to remember that the commission is the only entity that has the authority to claim an operator's bond. And so the process generally is that staff would issue an NOAV for an enforcement related issues. That NOAV goes to one of our AAGs or enforcement officers. The NOAV moves through the hearing process, and if staff is successful in requesting both the bond claim as well as the enforcement matters, the order will resolve the NOAV, impose a penalty, and claim the bond. Once that order becomes effective, staff would claim the bond, send the wells, associated facilities, and the bond to the Orphan Well program for plugging closure and reclamation. Another question that has come up pretty frequently are, what are the allowable uses for the Orphan Well Fund? Can it fund additional FTE? And I think that this is kind of in the vein of thinking towards a very specific fee tailored to an Orphan Well program. And so we wanted to clarify a couple of things, in that we don't have a true Orphan Well fund at Ugcc. Right now, our Orphan Well program is funded out of our allocations from the Joint Budget Committee through the Long Bill. And currently, what is spent on Orphan Well work is generated by mostly mill levy penalties and perhaps some severance tax. So this is the same revenue stream as our FTE and other operational costs. So I think the big picture question is, if we want to develop, FTE or database, I don't know that using, dollars that we would plan to spend or spending out of our appropriation for orphan wells would be probably my recommendation. Mostly because I think that the dollars allocated to orphan wells should really be spent on the Orphan Well program, but we could look at other operational programs to think about database or administration. Next, another question that's come up fairly frequently is around, we've been focused on, financial assurance for wells and for reclaiming locations, but what about other oil and gas related facilities that are within the commission's jurisdiction? And I just wanted to, reiterate that right now we are collecting financial assurance for more than just wells, right? We have specific bond or financial assurance requirements for seismic, natural gas gathering, processing and storage, produced water transfer systems, centralized EMP waste management facilities, and surface facilities associated with Class 2 commercial injection control wells. I missed a close parentheses on this slide, so I apologize. And these are, again, separate from the operator's bonding for its wells and locations. There are a couple of other current rule provisions that allow staff to request an increase in financial assurance, and then there's a separate regulatory requirement to maintain general liability insurance. And so all of these pieces are certainly a factor in what I'm thinking about as I'm looking to prepare draft rules for this commission's consideration and for input through the rulemaking process from the public, from stakeholders, and from the parties. A couple of interrelated questions are, why do wells shift from idle to active throughout the year? And I think that's a question best answered by industry. I mean, I would rather have them respond. And then how does tracking this work as a criteria for additional financial assurance? And I just wanted to remind us that that's really what our inactive well financial assurance requirements is about. If a well has not produced for over a year, it is considered inactive in our system and would be subject to additional financial assurance requirements based on its depth. And I think just a good comparison point, we talk a lot about stripper wells. Stripper wells are defined as oil wells with a daily production of less than 15 barrels per day, and gas wells with an average daily production of less than 90,000 cubic feet. So our inactive well is well, I hate using well that many times in a sentence, but our definition of inactive wells is substantially lower than the definition of stripper wells. And so as we're looking at the spectrum of things to be thinking about, I think this is part of that conversation. Another question is really looking to our partners at the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, which is another division housed within the Department of Natural Resources, and how they calculate, full bonding and what the TABOR implications are. And DRMS, much like COGCC, accepts cash bonds, CDs, corporate sureties, and some unique property rights. COGCC hasn't accepted kind of those unique property rights. And DRMS calculates the full bonding amount by calculating the cost of reclamation based on the disturbance conducted by the mining activity. And so if it's a big mine, that can go in phases, and as changes occur on site, DRMS can update that bond calculation and with major changes or every 5 years. DRMS, much like COGCC, holds financial assurance while the operator is mining and until reclamation is complete to the DRMS standards. So when we think about TABOR, financial assurance isn't, they're not funds payable or spendable by either DRMS or COGCC. They're held kind of in trust. I don't know if that's the right legal word, but they're held separately from our cash account, which means they're not part of the TABOR calculation. So I think that kind of buttons up that question. And I think the TABOR piece, applies equally to COGCC and DRMS as it relates to holding financial assurance. Kind of delving into some more of the orphan well questions. Are there currently unidentified orphan wells? How many and why? I think reviewing kind of the programmatic history of our orphan well program is helpful in this arena. Prior to 2017, we had a couple of different units within our agency that tracked and monitored orphan wells and orphan locations. In 2017, we realized we really needed to centralize that program and develop it out and formalize its structure. Dave Andrews, our engineering manager, led that initiative and developed all of the entire Google microsite dedicated to the orphan well program that has a lot of information about the history of the program, where our spending is and everything, and a lot of related information. And so again, with that 2017 initiative, we really focused our efforts in identifying all the known orphan wells, and through historic knowledge, we're aware that there are probably some unidentified orphan wells in a couple of fields in Colorado, the Rangeley Field and the Florence Field. These are fields that were developed in the 30s and 40s before the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation even existed. And so we understand that they're out there. We haven't, dedicating resources to identify those wells hasn't been the top priority for our orphan well program. We've been focused on plugging and reclaiming high priority locations. So it's a much more verbose answer perhaps than what's on the screen, but I hope that provides some context as to why they're unknown orphans, and it's because they predate, their existence and abandonment predates OGCC as an organization. Next slide. How is the orphan well work prioritized? As with the changes in the centralization of the orphan well program within COGCC, we also had an executive order from then Governor Hickenlooper directing us to really formalize the process around prioritizing work for orphan wells. So our orphan well team gathers once a year to prioritize any orphan wells that were added during that fiscal year. And as a result of that, we come out with a priority list. It's high, medium, and low priority, based really on our perception of risk to, impairing use or creating issues. And our goal is to complete the high and medium priority work first. And so that the work on where we are in terms of how wells are ranked or locations are ranked is available in our September 1 annual report. Progress on the Orphan Well program and individual claims, or like individual Orphan Well projects, is available again on the COGCC Orphan Well website. That website is listed at the bottom of this slide. How much money has been paid for orphan wells that has been borne by taxpayers? $0 from COGCC. We have not spent any general fund or general taxes on orphan wells. All of the work on COGCC's Orphan Well program is funded by COGCC's revenue streams, which are generally mill levy, severance tax, and penalties. Next slide. Does COGCC hold any self bonds right now with any operators? I thought the answer was 0. When I checked with our team, we actually have 3. They're fairly minimal. It's something that's been disfavored and that staff has been unwilling to accept for quite a while. So now this is where we're transitioning from the question and answer section into the what is the data that staff has put together to help focus all of our conversation using a common set of facts based on data gathered from our database. One of the asks was to provide comparative form financial assurance, wells, stripper wells, and production data for operators, including the number of stripper wells. I think I missed that. To do that, we've prepared 2 spreadsheets. The first includes a great deal of information about operator-specific data, and the second has stripper well information. I think I just want to remind everybody that our database changes daily, and so the data that we're providing to help guide our conversation about financial assurance in these spreadsheets is a snapshot of that data. And so things may evolve between now and October or now and tomorrow, but I think that this can be at least a commonly used set of information as we're trying to guide our conversations through this process. So again, that information is available on the COGCC Financial Assurance Additional Resources webpage. I can, once we wrap up the presentation, I'll navigate to it to help people understand how to get there. They're pretty enormous spreadsheets, so bear with us, but it's the data that we need to help guide this conversation. Next, on orphan well bonding and spending, again, there's been a lot of questions about how many wells are associated with claimed financial assurance and how is that spending going. Dave Andrews put together a list of kind of bond claim information. So you can see operator bond claim, bond amount, and the order number, so people can dig into and really wrestle with what that information can provide. In addition, Dave's team, the Orphan Well program tracks and publicizes its spending by bond claim on its Orphan Well project list website. And again, that's updated, I think, fairly frequently and is accessible at any time, anywhere with real-time data. So I can drive us to that if that would be helpful also. On the plugging and reclamation side, there was a request for additional information from industry in the state about the cost of P&A and reclaim wells around the state. So what we did in response are a couple of things, and this is where I'm about to hand it over to Joel. I had the Orphan Well team take a look at our Orphan Well costs and update our estimate. We've been using an $82,500 estimate for plugging and reclaiming an Orphan Well that dated back to information gathered in 2017. So we've updated that estimate. Here's a little bit of information about how Dave's team performed that work. We picked 23 sites. We excluded the extreme high and low cost outliers. And we wanted to only include projects that were complete or near enough completion to estimate final costs. The sites selected represent any number of the basins, oil and gas basins in Colorado. So I think we have a good statewide perspective. And all sites had plugging and decommissioning work. And so we think about plugging. Plugging is, securing a well and making sure it no longer produces. But all of the ancillary surface facilities also need to be decommissioned as part of that process. So we're thinking about removing tanks, production equipment, flow lines, et cetera. So I'm going to start with presenting this information in graph form for those folks who are better with the visuals. You can see the plugging work is represented in the red bars. The individual locations chosen for this analysis are the numbers at the bottom. If we want to connect those numbers to actual locations, let me know. but you can see kind of the range of plugging costs are the red again. The blue in the middle are remediation work. So if there was an environmental impact that's dealt with there, you can see it does not occur at every site. And also green represents the cost of reclamation. So that's the generalized information, right? At a high cost, we're just over $140,000. At a low cost, we're somewhere around $30,000, $35,000. I think to get to what would be the sideboards for our conversation, the costs, range from $25,000 to $144,000. Average and median costs are around $77,000. Plugging and decommissioning costs range from $22,000 to $83,000, with an average cost around $50,000. So again, the average cost to deal with plugging the well and removing the related equipment was around $50,000. Environmental costs had a range of $0 to $33,000, and reclamation costs range from $0 to $56,000. So that's a snapshot or an updated set of data from our Orphan well team about the actual costs that we have incurred when we're plugging, decommissioning, and reclaiming orphaned well sites. At this point, I think I would like to hand it over to Joel to talk about some additional reclamation cost estimates that we gathered through this process as well.
Thank you, Director Murphy. So I will be presenting staff's response to both the Commission's questions about reclamation costs, as well as an overview of the literature review that staff conducted of emissions from idle wells. So turning first to reclamation costs, on the screen, there's a table showing staff's estimate of the average costs of reclaiming locations of various sizes. And before I begin, I'll just take a moment to acknowledge the very hard work done by Dr. Denise Arthur, Curtis Conklin, and Eric Nickel, who are the staff experts that compiled and analyzed the data that I'm presenting today. I will quickly summarize how staff arrived at these estimates, then walk you through some of the highlights of the data. To compile the cost estimate, staff relied on multiple sources. First, staff used its own extensive expertise with reviewing invoices for reclamation projects that are associated with the Orphan Well program. Second, staff reviewed typical contractor pricing. And finally, staff consulted directly with multiple contractors to ensure that the prices they were reviewing are current. Staff considered contractor pricing statewide and did review invoices from contractors throughout the state, so the cost estimates therefore do reflect a reasonable statewide estimate, factoring in variability among basins. And staff also cross-checked the price estimates with the RS Means Heavy Construction Cost Database, which is a commonly used tool for estimating contractor prices. Staff assumed a scope of work of final reclamation for the entire area of disturbance that would be fully compliant with COGCC's reclamation rules, including the full life cycle of the final reclamation project, which would include multiple years of work. For example, staff factored in the costs of multiple years of stormwater inspections and monitoring. Because staff assumed full compliance, it did not factor in costs associated with an operator having to redo portions of its reclamation work, which does occur in some circumstances of non-compliance or when final reclamation is not successful on the first go-around. Staff assumed that the final reclamation process will take 1 to 2 years. This may be an underestimate because at some locations it may take 3 to 5 years to achieve full revegetation, which means that staff's cost estimates presented here are conservatively low. Turning now to the data, you can see that staff identified multiple variables that drive differences in reclamation costs. These include location size, which is the number of disturbed acres, whether a location is flat or elevated, which could require cut and fill work, and whether soil is sandy or if it is more suitable for vegetation growth. Because soil characteristics and topography vary significantly statewide and do vary significantly even within basins, COGCC does not have sufficient information to estimate the percentage of locations that meet the criteria of each variable in order to provide a single statewide average estimate of reclamation costs. Additionally, as you can see, whether an operator properly preserves topsoil is a significant cost driver. An operator's failure to properly preserve topsoil would require the operator to add new topsoil to the location, which in general more than doubles reclamation costs. Staff assumes that topsoil costs $60 per cubic yard. Whether an operator has properly preserved topsoil is thus a variable that cannot be predicted because it essentially assumes non-compliance with COGCC's reclamation rules, which again makes it difficult to calculate a single average. Next slide, please. This slide represents the data from the previous slide in a graphical form for those of you who are more visual learners. And as you can see, reclamation costs increase linearly as location size increases. So next slide, please. Location size is clearly one of the most significant drivers of reclamation costs. However, it is worth noting that most oil and gas locations are on the smaller end of the spectrum. Staff estimates that 97.49% of locations statewide are less than 5 acres. So that would be essentially locations that fall into the first line of the table that was shown earlier. And this estimate does reflect that many locations predate the requirement for a Form 2A, which was adopted in 2009, and staff thus does not have data about the exact size of most of those locations, and just assumed that those locations predating the Form A are 5 acres or less in size, given the typical development patterns prior to 2009. Because most locations are on the smaller end of the spectrum, it is worth noting that the highest cost estimates I presented on the earlier slide, which would be for a 20-acre location on a cut and fill slope with sandy soils and no topsoil preserved, is very unlikely to actually happen in practice because there are so few locations that are that large in size. And even at large locations, it's unlikely that every single variable that would increase reclamation costs would be present altogether. Next slide, please. And while most existing locations are small, it is important to note that average location size is increasing over time. We probably should have flipped the bar chart representation on this graph, but the red bar on the right is in fact locations from the past 3 years, whereas the blue bar graph is 2As that are currently in process. And it does show that there has been an increase even in recent years from 8 to 10 acres in average size. Staff anticipates that this trend will continue because the emission change regulations provide even stronger incentives for operators to concentrate their operations onto a single large surface location to better avoid cumulative impacts such as habitat fragmentation. Next slide, please. I will now turn to the question about emissions from inactive and plugged wells. COGCC conducted a literature review that identified 12 published peer-reviewed studies that measured or otherwise calculated methane emissions from idle wells and plugged wells. The literature review is now publicly available on COGCC's website on the same financial assurance page as the Orphan well program data that Director Murphy discussed earlier. Before I start summarizing the data, I'd like to briefly explain some terminology. The literature review divides wells into active, plugged, and idle categories. Active wells are currently producing. Plugged wells have been permanently plugged, and idle wells are wells that are not producing and have not been permanently plugged, which includes wells that are classified as abandoned, temporarily abandoned, and shut in. Each of the studies that COGCC reviewed use slightly different terms for idle wells, which reflects that they were conducted in different jurisdictions that have distinct classifications. COGCC thus used the term idle well in the literature review as a catch-all, even though that is not a term that is used in COGCC's own rules or well status codes. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the key high-level findings of the literature review, and I'll provide a bit of commentary to help you understand each point. First, all of the studies that COGCC reviewed found that idle wells do emit some methane, but generally at low rates. Those rates varied, but were in all cases at least an order of magnitude below emissions from active wells. This means that there are relatively minor emissions benefits of plugging an idle well compared to other sources of emissions reductions associated with the end of a well's life cycle, such as decommissioning equipment that has associated emissions like a storage tank, or simply taking a well out of production in the first place. Second, nearly all of the studies found that plugged wells have negligible or near zero emissions. This is encouraging because plugged wells should not be able to emit into the atmosphere. The lone exception to this finding was a study conducted in Pennsylvania, where state regulations require plugged wells in coal mining areas to be equipped with methane vents that allow methane to escape into the atmosphere as a method of promoting safety for coal miners. Third, emissions varied substantially among states and even among basins within states. In general, studies conducted in the Western United States found lower emissions than studies conducted in the Appalachian Basin. The studies hypothesized that this is attributable to multiple factors, including that many wells in the Appalachian Basin were much older and were either abandoned or plugged prior to modern regulatory requirements. Additionally, several studies found that co-location of coal deposits increased emissions, and not all oil and gas basins are coextensive with coal formations. Fourth, all of the studies found that emissions were driven or skewed by a handful of so-called super emitters. These are wells with significant integrity issues that provide a pathway for methane to enter the atmosphere. It is possible, and perhaps even likely, that Colorado has fewer super emitters than other states because of COGCC's regulations requiring periodic health checks on all wells, which include monthly Bradenhead monitoring, annual Bradenhead testing, and periodic mechanical integrity testing, along with the Air Quality Control Commission's requirement for periodic leak detection and repair inspections, better known as LDAR. Fifth, most of the studies that COGCC reviewed used variations on a methodology that was first developed in a 2014 paper by Dr. Mary King et al. Involving the use of a static chamber to measure well emissions. That makes the results of the studies more directly comparable, as I will show on the next slide in just a moment. However, this also highlights that it is a fairly recent area of scientific inquiry, and like all emerging areas of scientific inquiry, that means that there is some scientific uncertainty associated with the study's findings. We are very much still in the midst of academics exploring the best way to conduct this type of study, which means that there's not yet a definitive scientific answer to the question of how much do idle wells emit and why. That leads me to my sixth point, which is that only 2 of the studies that COGCC identified were conducted in Colorado, and only one of those 2 studies used Dr. King's method to directly measure emissions. That study was published in 2016 by Dr. Amy Townsend Small et al., and it only measured emissions from a handful of wells in the Denver-Julesburg Basin. Dr. Townsend Small concluded that collectively, plugged-in idle wells contribute only 0.1% to 0.2% of total methane emissions in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, which actually disproved her hypothesis that plugged-in idle wells might be the source of the gap between methane measured in top-down studies and bottom-up methane emissions inventories. As I believe you've all heard at various points, sometimes those numbers are different, and it seems like idle wells are probably not the source of that gap, at least in Colorado. And finally, this highlights that the current literature is too limited to provide a single definitive estimate of average methane emissions from idle and plugged wells in Colorado at this time. More research will be needed statewide, I apologize for my dog, to provide a more definitive estimate of average emissions from idle and plugged wells in Colorado, including studies that measured emissions in basins outside of the Denver-Julesburg Basin. Next slide, please. This is Table 1 from COGCC's literature review, which compares the findings of the studies that measured methane emissions using Dr. King's static chamber method. As you can see, for the most part, the studies found that plugged wells emitted close to 0, with the exception of Dr. King's own 2016 study from Pennsylvania that I mentioned earlier. There is a much wider range of emissions found from idle wells, but all of the studies conducted in the Western United States found emissions between 0 and 10 grams per hour, with some of the studies in the Appalachian Basin identifying higher emissions, though notably not all of them. West Virginia had much lower emissions, which again highlights that variations in state regulations actually drive a lot of the differences, not only some of the geologic differences, like whether something overlies a coal mine. Regardless, all of these emissions were much lower than emissions that were measured from active wells, as you can see. Next slide, please. This is a figure from one of the studies that was conducted, or at least commissioned and paid for by the California Energy Commission, a state agency. I would just like to quickly note that this is a logarithmic scale. So each line of the graph is an order of magnitude, not a linear progression. And it highlights the general trend of plugged wells having much lower emissions than idle wells and active wells. And also that a few super emitters, the few lines on the bar graph that are on the left side of the graph, can really substantially skew total emissions figures. As you can see, that one active well has emissions of 10 to the 6th power compared to, most of the idle wells are in that 10 to the 1 power, even 10 to the -2 power. There's sort of a sink for methane emissions, which is generally where the plugged wells are falling. Next slide, please. This is another figure from the California Energy Commission study. It is also on a logarithmic scale, and it shows that idle wells have lower emissions than active wells. That would be the golden and green dots on the graph. And also that plugged wells have much lower emissions, the light blue dot on the far right side of the graph, that are close to 0. And so finally, before I turn it back over to Director Murphy to talk about other sort of next steps and open areas of inquiry, I'd just like to quickly note that 5 of the studies that COGCC identified in the literature review were initially behind paywalls, and COGCC was not able to purchase those studies until yesterday. So some data from the publicly available abstracts from those studies is included in the literature review, but COGCC may still update the literature review in the near future to provide a more detailed description after it has had time to review those studies in greater depth. With that, I will turn it back over to Director Murphy.
So I think we can all agree that Joel's dive might take a little bit of time to digest. And so if we want to come back and talk about it again, I totally get that. Every time I hear it, read it, think about it, I learn and digest more. So I think, Joel, you might get a hot round of questions once I wrap up. I don't have much left, so let me make sure. So I think that there were a couple of outstanding questions about how other states do things that I wasn't able to connect with our partners on, but I will work on connecting with Alaska, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Texas to dive into some of those pieces around what their experience has been with financial assurance. Again, I think that we identified about 8 questions that I think would be appropriate for industry to help tackle. What are the reasons an operator shifts between idle and active throughout a year? How does an operator budget for plugging in abandonment with a well as reaching the end of life, and what factors are considered? Are there examples of operators occupying/operating at low production vertical locations? And why would an operator choose to sell or not sell in those circumstances? Are there other incentives for plugging wells that we could be thinking about? Is it possible to project or estimate production for a year from a well kind of in a forward-looking way, so that then you look back on what was actually produced and see if it lined up with expectations? And then how frequently would you expect a difference between those two? The 6th question, if we look back 3 to 5 or 10 or 20 years about the status for a well before it became orphan, were they stripper wells? What other production data do we have that could help inform our analysis of kind of is there a risk of becoming orphan or not? And then any information from industry about cost to plug and abandon and reclaim from around the state in different basins, different depths of wells, that would also be helpful. And then lastly, what factors or criteria go into determining whether to operate P&A, temporarily abandon, or sell a particular well? So those are the questions, and I can work with the trades and other industry partners who participated in the financial assurance informational docket around these questions. And that's going to lead to kind of what I would call Julie's vision of next steps. And I say Julie because it truly is mine. I think that this is me trying to get the ball moving and make sure we know where we're going. I think that given the couple additional places where staff needs to dive into data and also a pretty robust set of questions for industry, I would recommend that we reconvene in a couple of weeks to hear back on those points. And again, if we are going to make any updates to the literature review that Joel reviewed, we could present that piece at that time as well. I would be looking at May 19th through 26th. My goal has been to try to get rules noticed sooner rather than later, so that we can have a robust pre-hearing process, have a hearing in the fall, and wrap up our work on this very important topic. So again, looking at an early June notice, letting the pre-hearing process run from that June time period through early September. I know our partners at the Air Pollution Control Division have a very important rulemaking that involves many of the same stakeholders who work with us every day in mid-September. And so my goal is to try to avoid that early September timeframe when folks are probably going to be focusing very, very closely on preparing for that September 16th and 17th hearing date. Recognizing that rulemaking will then proceed in December. I think we might have a sweet spot in late September and October to try to button up this rulemaking. So this is, again, my suggested timeline. I think it can work. I think we learned a lot last fall about how rulemakings work. The good news is for both us and our stakeholders that we are only dealing with one rule series and a fairly finite set of topics. So I think we can have a pretty focused conversation on it. So with that does wrap up the presentation materials. I've offered to try to drive on the website to where all that financial assurance data is living. We can talk about next steps. We can take questions. I'll follow your lead, Chair, about which of those 3 options we should jump into first.
Staff for the very exhaustive set of information for us. I agree. I think looking at what you've provided us, 30 slides that contain a ton of good information. I think that we need to make sure that we get the slideshow up on our website so that everyone can take a look at that, give commissioners a chance to sort of dive a little deeper into this. And I think the idea of getting the information from industry stakeholders, from discussions that I've had, I think a week or so to get that information, and then coming back in May 19th or so and having a next round of discussions does make some sense. So now I am looking at my fellow commissioners. Any initial comments from commissioners before we dive into questions? All right, well, I'll start with a question to Joel at AG Minor. If we could go back to slide 22, which was the slide regarding the emissions literature review. Joel, there is just a ton of information here. And interestingly, you know, we hear a lot from members of the public. I've read in some, you know, some news articles, et cetera, that idle wells and plugged wells are big emitters and real problems. And it looks like from your emissions literature review that that's not the conclusion that you find from the peer-reviewed documents. Could you kind of like, I don't know, go back through this or summarize this or give us your big takeaways, or just, you know, I want to give you another shot at swinging at all this, because there's just a ton of information here.
Of course, Mr. Chair, and of course there's more information and more detail provided in the written literature review, which is also available on the website for you and any member of the public to look through. That literature review also includes links to each of the peer-reviewed studies that are publicly available so that people can also look at the original sources. You're right, Mr. Chair, that I think we hear a lot about emissions from idle wells and sometimes plugged wells. The literature does not conclude that those are zero, right? That there are some emissions. They do seem to be lower than maybe the public perception would suggest. And again, this is a new area of inquiry. I think that some of the sort of disconnect is attributable to three things. One is that most of the early studies were actually conducted in Pennsylvania, where again, the emissions are much higher, but that is due to sort of the regulatory quirks of Pennsylvania, and those findings are not as cross-applicable as researchers have explored more of those emissions in Colorado. I also think that there are super emitters, right? There are some idle and plugged wells that emit a lot, but they are the exception rather than the rule. But when there is one of those super emitters that is found that is high profile, that can sometimes color the public's perception, right? If there's an article about, wow, a plugged well was found that, you know, did have really high emissions, that's a problem. And then finally, there has been a lot of focus, particularly from the US Environmental Protection Agency, of trying to build an accurate picture of plugged and idle wells into national emissions inventories. And so when data from all over the country together with the total number of orphaned or idle or plugged wells is aggregated, those are high emissions numbers when sort of viewed collectively. And I think that often there have been several recent studies that did do that aggregation. And so when looking at it together, it is a big number. But for our purposes, when we are a state regulatory agency that is sort of looking at the emissions profile of what are the different sources of emissions from the oil and gas sector that COGCC regulates in the upstream sector, it does show that the emissions from idle wells and plugged wells are very low compared to other sources of emissions. So again, bringing a well from an oil and gas location from producing to non-producing has emissions benefits, certainly, but that's what operators will no doubt, when they apply for oil and gas development plans and comprehensive area plans, show as an emissions benefit of part of their plans to decommission locations nearby. But much of those emissions benefits likely come from decommissioning storage tanks, pneumatic controllers, all of the surface equipment that we know has emissions, and also bringing a well from active to inactive status, right? Making sure that it's no longer producing. And that's probably where the main emissions benefits come from. It's not really from the studies would show turning those inactive wells into plugged wells. And that's good news. It means that COGCC's regulations are working, right? It means that all of the rules that we have in place that the engineering team has developed and the commission approved through wellbore integrity for things like braided head monitoring, braided head testing, as well as mechanical integrity testing that has gone on for years and been strengthened recently. All of that is doing a good job of making sure that there are not integrity issues that would allow a pathway for methane to escape from the wellbore and enter to the atmosphere. So that was maybe a longer answer than you needed, but that would be my interpretation of why there is a bit of a disconnect between sometimes what is the public perception and maybe what the results of these studies found.
Great. Thank you, Joel, for that sort of recap. Take you away from your notes, and you do an amazing job of sort of summarizing for us. While we're on this topic, I'm looking to other commissioners. Does anyone else have questions for AAG Minor on that part of the presentation? I'm trying to sort of segment it out, and then we can take questions on some of the other parts of the presentation. Commissioner Nanjappa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Director Murphy and AAG Minor for all of this information. I definitely feel like I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it all. But one thing that I think you mentioned was some of the variability among different areas of the country in terms of where some of these studies have been conducted. I think it was a different slide where you were kind of showing the different rates that were measured, like in the Appalachian Basin and others. Did you say that some of that was related to the regulations in those areas? So in other words, some states just may allow more and therefore the measurements may be higher? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, Commissioner Njaba, that is correct. I think a really interesting example of that is the 2019 study by Riddick et al. From West Virginia. If you look on this slide, you can see that both the 2016 study by King et al. In Pennsylvania, the Peckney study in Pennsylvania, and the Townsend Small study that looked at emissions in Ohio's Appalachian Basin, all found higher emission rates than were found in some of the studies conducted in the Western US. Townsend Small et al. Actually studied emissions in both the Western United States and the Eastern United States, including fields in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. So the West Virginia study set out to see, like, is this true throughout the Appalachian Basin? And actually found that it wasn't, which I think is attributable to a couple factors, which the studies have to guess what the causes are. They're not necessarily proving or disproving any one cause, but certainly a major factor is, again, that Pennsylvania does require that plugged wells have in coal mining areas have those methane vents, which is intended to provide a pathway for methane to enter the atmosphere, again, to make sure that there isn't a buildup of methane in the coal mine that would be dangerous to coal miners. And then also some of it has to do with sort of the timing of development. Many wells in Pennsylvania and actually also Ohio were developed in the 1800s and long predate regulations of any kind, and particularly including plugging regulations. And I believe that the Riddick study noted that some of the development, more of the development in West Virginia actually sort of post-dated when there were regulations and things like plugging. And I believe I would need to double check this. I believe the Riddick study also noted that West Virginia had a little more robust requirements for shut-in and temporarily abandoned wells, the wells in the idle category. So I think that all of that together sort of shows that while there is variation among basins, and even within basins, there were very different numbers in different parts of Pennsylvania, for example, that King found in 2016. Much of the difference is driven not only by those sort of geologic factors, but also by the state regulations. And that's why more research conducted directly in Colorado would be valuable. Colorado does have unique, and in my opinion, the best and strongest wellbore integrity regulations in the country after our recent 2020 rulemaking. And the Townsend Small study was obviously conducted prior to then, and it would be really interesting to see both how emissions compare between basins in Colorado. We obviously have multiple basins that are coal bed methane or overlie coal formations, to see how that plays out in Colorado, to perhaps compare primarily gas producing basins and oil producing basins, which were generally found to have differences in the different states. And also to see how well our regulations are working and how true it is that the braided head testing and monitoring requirements adopted in wellbore integrity really are finding ways to proactively identify and address integrity issues that lead to emissions, particularly in those idle wells, inactive and temporarily abandoned shut-in wells. So more research is needed, but there is fairly clear evidence, and there was a conclusion on nearly all the studies, that state regulatory differences do drive those differences.
Thank you, AG Minor. That's very helpful. And this is maybe a bit of an aside, but do we track prior mining operations with respect to our considerations for our locations? I was just trying to remember, even from our recent rulemaking, in terms of the types of information that we require with a Form 2A, for example. Just in terms of that type of consideration of the geology and the potential impacts of other emissions, or are we, because of our wellbore integrity and our other requirements, is that not as much of an issue as it is, for example, in Pennsylvania? I'm just trying to understand that a little bit more.
Commissioner, if I may. And I think Joel, maybe you can jump in with regulatory sites as appropriate, but and I'm going to harken back to my days as an AAG for the Division of Reclamation, Mining and Safety. We don't have coal mining in the same ways in Colorado as they do in Pennsylvania and the Appalachia in particular. That said, so we've never had regulatory requirements around plugging wells that are designed to protect coal mine workers, right? And that's really what was driving the Pennsylvania component. That said, we do have overlap between, coal formations and oil and gas formations. That's what coal bed methane is. We have methane seeps in Colorado that are naturally occurring. And we do have requirements when we're looking at wellbore locations for consideration of subsurface coal mining. And that's where I might need Joel's help if he remembers from last fall, those particular pieces. But if I unpack kind of the tenor and tone of your questions, that felt like kind of the three layers to it of, do we need to protect coal miners? Not really. Do we need to be aware of the geology? Yes. And do we have regulatory considerations for it? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think that gets to it. I was thinking of it more in terms of a buildup of the gas in those coal formations, and actually thinking less about the workers, but that makes complete sense. And that I hadn't sort of made that connection, but that makes complete sense in areas out east. But yeah, I think that addresses those questions. Unless Joel had anything else to add. AAG Minor, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, I would just quickly note that most of the studies have done isotopic analysis, which allows them to sort of disaggregate what methane comes from a coal formation versus a natural gas formation. And I do think that Colorado has a specific rule that would sort of help with that, which is Rule 212, which requires isolation of coal seams. So we do have rules that require coal seams to be isolated to ensure that there's no flow in the wellbore in the same way the groundwater formation is isolated. And that is both a regulatory requirement and a statutory requirement. So in addition to Article 60, which we generally think of as the Oil and Gas Act, there is an entire Article 61 that sets requirements to ensure that oil and gas operations do not interfere with mining activities, in short. So we have robust protections that, and I would guess that a study conducted sort of more throughout Colorado's basins would be able to perform an isotopic analysis and perhaps confirm whether those regulations are working.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you everyone that worked on this information that was provided. I'll agree that the amount of data is significant and will take me time to absorb, but I really appreciate the time and effort that was put into it in order to answer a lot of the outstanding questions that we had as we start to move into the financial assurances rulemaking. I did have a couple of questions around the kind of the analysis to determine costs for plugging, abandoning, remediation, and reclamation. So if we could go to that slide, because this one, yeah, the one back, not that one. Nope. Yep, that one. So I wanted to make sure that I understood this slide, because I mean, I understand the different things, but are we determining based on the information that was analyzed and the process to analyze that data, that overall, including plugging, decommissioning, environmental costs, reclamation costs, that the average and median costs in staff's opinion is $77,278 for the average and $77,759 for the median, all in?
Yeah, so this isn't staff's opinion so much as based on this actual out-of-pocket costs for plugging, reclaiming, remediating orphan well sites.
Right.
So this is a little bit different from the analysis that Joel presented that looked more broadly at different data sources for reclamation. This is really what we've actually spent it through the Orphan well program. So
Okay.
it's a narrower bandwidth of, or it's a narrower source of sites. It's 23 sites.
Right. But this is from ones that COGCC has actually done the work on, has contracted the work on.
Correct.
And then how does this comport then with what AAG Minor presented? Because the remediation or reclamation costs on those seem, significantly higher than what the costs are in this. And so how do those two things tie together, I guess?
If I could, Commissioner Mesner, Director Murphy, could you move to the first slide in reclamation? I actually think that the data is consistent. Yeah. So again, the vast majority, 97% of locations are in probably that first line on the graph, right? The lowest, maybe up to 5 acres. And most sites are typical. They are not on a steep slope. They have ordinary soils, not sandy soils. So probably most would fall in that 32,589 category. Again, there's enough variability among all the locations in the state that it wasn't sort of possible to come up with a statewide average. But I think if you sort of compare that, 30,000 maybe up to 60,000 or 36,000 for factoring in different variables with sort of the reclamation costs that staff has found in the Orphan well program on the prior graph, you can see that there is actually a fair amount of consistency in coming in that maybe in that average range. So again, that doesn't mean that, if there is a location that is 20 acres, perhaps a newer one that is built on a steep slope and has sandy soils, that would be far more expensive to reclaim. That's not something staff has ever done through the Orphan well program. Again, probably because it's a newer location, right? And the Orphan well program tends to have older locations. But I actually think that there's consistency in the data. And of course, staff did rely in part on invoices from the Orphan well program and coming up with the data here. And then I think you mentioned remediation also in your question, that this only presents reclamation costs. It does not address remediation costs, which again, only occur at sites that have had a spill or other issue that has to be cleaned up.
Right. So my second question then is, there was a certain analysis and data points that were utilized in order to come up with both the information on this slide and on the previous slide. Can those data points be utilized, at the time of permitting to determine what potentially end of life costs could be?
Commissioner, I think that those are the questions that we will need to wrestle with through the rulemaking itself, right? Because that presupposes what we would want to do on some level. And so I think that, that's part of the guide, is understanding the bandwidth and the costs to help inform, how we want to make decisions around financial assurance for locations in Colorado. But I think that having the benefit of, you know, some of industry's input on this based on the questions we've asked would be helpful also.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that this be utilized. I just didn't know if this was something that could be utilized. Like, could you say, okay, if it's 5 acres or 10 acres or whatever it is, I mean, do you have the data? I mean, are these appropriate data points in order to be able to make some of those determinations? And we can wait until later in order to answer that question, but that's something that's that came to my mind.
I could maybe quickly respond to that, Commissioner Mesner. There would be challenges with that, and really one of the main challenges is the topsoil, right? So that column on the far right is an additive cost. So that is not, this would be the total cost of the project. We'd have to add that to the actual cost of reclamation. And I think that shows that something that we don't know at the permit stage, which is whether an operator will comply with topsoil salvaging rules and whether those efforts will be successful. Sometimes an effort at compliance won't be successful. That can be one of the most significant drivers of costs, right? It's a more than doubling. Additionally, remediation and environmental cleanup, there's no way of knowing if that will be necessary at a permitting stage, because it only is necessary if something goes wrong, if there's a spill or release in the course of 30 years or more of operating a facility. So while there is some factors that would allow predictability in advance, there are many that will really significantly vary and be impossible to predict over time, because they do sort of depend on future conditions that are unknown at the time of permitting.
That's fair. I appreciate that answer. I think the only other question I had was around how FTE is associated with the Orphan Well program. And I mean, I think what I'm hearing from the answer to that question is that if we wanted to potentially increase the capacity of the Orphan Well program to do more plugging, abandoning, reclamation, remediation of orphan wells, then it would require additional FTE one way or another.
I think that I'm going to answer this slightly differently, Commissioner, and so bear with me. But when the orphan well when the JBC changed the I can't think of the word, allocation, appropriation for orphan wells and jumped it from $445,000 to $5 million, it was accompanied by an increase of 5 FTE. And so those are the numbers we've been operating under.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Gonzalez, and then Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Director Murphy and to AAG Minor and to everyone who helped put this information together. Just a substantial presentation, really, really impressive and appreciated. I've got a question about the reclamation costs associated with total disturbance acreage. Is the figure used for total disturbance, is that like the initial disturbance, the all-in disturbance, or is that more of the kind of long-term disturbance for using those or for finding that associated reclamation cost?
Yes, so Ms. Larson, if you could perhaps zoom in, Dr. Arthur, to confirm that I get this right. I know she's here, but I believe it is the final disturbed acres, so this does not factor in interim reclamation. This was sort of the total area for final reclamation, but I believe would not include that interim reclamation area.
That's what I was hoping to hear, because I think that's the important figure to look at when I was looking at the 2As in process. I want to make sure that's what we were actually considering. So that kind of answers all my follow-up questions on that, but thank you for the answer, AAG Minor.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for all these, all of the helpful answers. I actually had pretty much the same question that Commissioner Gonzalez did, but what I was wondering is that other slide that you showed with the 2 red and blue bars, and I think you were saying this was these site acreage sizes are the initial site sizes. Is that correct? This is prior to interim reclamation?
I am almost certain that's true, but could we get Dr. Arthur to confirm that?
Yeah, so the reason we were doing this analysis is because the permits in the last 3 years all have 2As. So we've got all the permits in the last 2As, and we wanted to look at what the size of the disturbances were for the newer wells. And this is the total disturbance, and that could include the tank batteries if they're separate from the location and so on and so forth. So it is the total disturbed area that would need to be reclaimed. We do have situations, where they do the interim reclamation, but that is put on hold for other operations that might come up later. So these are final reclamation.
I'm sorry, Dr. Arthur, did you just say these aren't, or these are final?
Yeah, I'm sorry. These are for final reclamation, which would include all areas disturbed, yes.
So, but Dr. Arthur, the bar graphs on the screen are the total disturbed acre initially, right? When you say these are final reclamation, you mean the data that you gathered on the other slide, right?
So we tried to do an analysis on, the total disturbed areas on these, yes, per the 2A. Is that the question, Joel? Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry if I may, Dr. Arthur. So what I'm trying to kind of sort out is this slide, I think, is showing kind of how the average pad size is perhaps increasing. Correct. And that's the total disturbance area that is proposed in a 2A. But then the other figures are talking about the costs of reclamation based on the final pad size after some interim reclamation has occurred.
No, they're all final. No, yeah, they're all for final reclamation. So
I mean, I understand that. What I'm asking is the other figures. I think we just heard when if you can flip to that other slide with the acreages and the costs. This slide is talking about what the cost for reclamation is for the pad size after some interim reclamation has occurred. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. So what we wanted to do was capture the final reclamation and all of the disturbed area that was used for the oil and gas location, because and so what I was trying to say about the interim, the reason we did that was because some of those interim areas are held out for potential other operations. And so these numbers that you see before you, the 1, 5, 10, and 20 acres, are those areas that were the total disturbance when they drilled. It doesn't reduce the size for interim reclamation.
Okay.
It's at the end, yes.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying. And so in that case, then with the average costs that were presented, which was inclusive of the full cost of plugging and abandonment and reclamation, averaging around $77,000. And I think Joel, AAG minor, you were mentioning that typically we're kind of in this first tier of what's shown here on the slide of the locations being more in that typical non-sandy soil and flat and et cetera. What I'm trying to kind of understand though is that these interim these final reclamation costs or these total reclamation costs are, it seems like if this is just reclamation, then we're talking about quite a bit more of cost if we've got the site that becomes orphaned and we're having to do all of that. So am I misunderstanding? I just want to make sure that I'm clear on all these numbers and how they relate.
Can I try? Yes, okay. So the numbers that Dave Andrews' team put together for the actual costs that we've spent for orphan wells have generally been on very small locations, right? That are flat, that apparently have topsoil, that don't have some of these cost drivers that you see on the slide of what Denise has put together. So, or Dr. Arthur has put together. And so, again, I think that's where they align. I'm going to flip up really quick, hopefully if I can figure out how to. So if we look at the reclamation costs and this bottom line item of actual out-of-pocket ranging from 0 to 56,000, that's a broad enough spectrum to include a number of these different line items and permutations and options. And so again, what we have done within our organization is very limited as to what the data you see on the screen. And so what we wanted to do was project out not just what we've seen as actual costs, because we recognize that our Orphan Well program has seen a very limited slice of the pie, if you will, of reclamation costs, and understand what other cost drivers there are that we should be thinking about and understanding as we look across the state in different circumstances. Does that help align the two data sets that don't talk to each other perfectly, but are in the same realm at least?
Control of my mute button. Yeah, thank you to both of you, Dr. Arthur and Director Murphy. I think I'm getting it. It's a little bit confusing to me because would it be true that generally speaking with our orphan well sites, they're perhaps beyond that initial production phase, so there has been some interim reclamation that would have been required and done?
I think a lot of our orphan well sites predate a lot of our rules. So we're getting things that were abandoned in the 50s. We're also getting, and so there's a large variability in the on-site compliance when I think about current status and how operators are currently in compliance with interim reclamation requirements and disturbance areas. And so it can be hard to compare the two for that reason alone, when we're thinking about the true cost of reclaiming a currently active operating oil and gas location.
Director Murphy, could I add, I think maybe I've poorly phrased some of the answers to my questions, but maybe this helps Commissioner Nanjapa. The data you see on the screen does not include the costs of interim reclamation activities. It does include the costs of final reclamation activities, some of which could occur in the interim reclamation area. Does that help clarify?
Yes, thank you, AG Minor. And I apologize if I'm going in circles here, but I think, so I understood that this is, the costs that may not include, interim reclamation, but is the cost for reclaiming the site. And I thought you had said initially that this was, kind of the final reclamation, like after there had been, some reclamation done. But what I'm also understanding is that in some cases we're talking about these orphan well sites that predate our regulations, and therefore maybe there hadn't been any, but they're still maybe smaller sites. Am I still getting that all twisted up?
Sure, I think there are two layers to your question. So one, I believe what Dr. Arthur was saying is that, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes some of the final reclamation activities, sort of regardless of, is it an orphan well site or not, might have to occur within the interim reclamation area. Sometimes that interim reclamation area is not fully reclaimed to what we would want in final reclamation for any number of reasons. And then separately, yes, the sites that the Orphan Well program has addressed have generally been smaller, it sounds like, than the newer locations that tend to be larger. And I think it's fair to say that some of the things that could drive high reclamation costs, like an absence of topsoil, are less likely to occur at those new sites because all operations have been conducted since 2009 after our new reclamation rules, and there have been proactive measures in place that would allow an operator to appropriately plan for final reclamation and therefore decrease their final reclamation costs because of that advanced planning work. So hopefully I answered that question well enough.
Thank you, AAG Minor. Yeah, no, I think I'm clearer on all of this in sort of understanding how they all relate together. So yeah, I think I'm good for now. Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just echo what everyone else said, which is great presentations today. So I think I already know my answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyway. The sample size we have for the orphan wells that the state has addressed is probably too small for us to say that there might be, and maybe we can answer this. If you're doing activities in northeastern Colorado, here's the average cost for plugging and abandoning and reclamation. If you're doing it in the DJ Basin, here's what the average cost might be, so that we could see variability in potentially in financial assurance needs at the end of the life of a well. But I'm thinking the sample size maybe is too small.
Commissioner McGowan, I don't want to comment on the statistical validity of the sample size, but I don't think it encompasses the breadth of oil and gas operations that we see across the state of Colorado, and that operators are reclaiming, day in and day out. And so I think that's where that information question to industry about what are the real statewide costs will be more informative. Hopefully they have the appropriate sample size.
Thanks.
If I can add, we did think about that question for the reclamation costs that you see here, and could we present, a weighted average by basin, and ultimately the reality is there are cut and fill slopes in the DJ Basin, and not every site in the Piceance Basin is on a cut and fill slope, and soil types vary within basins and among even close together sites sometimes. And again, Dr. Arthur can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but there is really a little too much variability in terms of the variables that drive reclamation costs, at least, to come up with a reasonable average by basin, just because there are variations within basin, just as the basins are different among the states. So there are trends, but not enough that we felt confident in calculating a weighted average.
Perfect answer.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for all the discussion, especially from Commissioner Nanjapa, kind of following up on my question about interim and total and final reclamation and kind of what all those things mean. And I want to dig into that just a tad bit deeper, and specifically on like the correlation between slide 17 with the cost per acre or cost per kind of acre range, and then over to the average disturbance for wells and kind of how those two may correlate. Because I was thinking about that as a correlation in terms of when we're thinking about financial assurance, and that's what we're tasked with in this rulemaking, is typically we're going to be looking at the end of a life of a well. It's going to be after, an operator may or may not abandon a well when they have subsequent operations following there. They may or may not abandon a well when they are post or pre-interim reclamation. But my assumption is, and anyone's welcome to clear this up, that typically when we are faced with orphan wells or faced with the prospect of there being a need for execution on the financial assurance from the operator, those wells are typically post-interim reclamation, and they're not going to be waiting on any further operations on that well site. And so when I think about that, and I think about the amount of acreage represented on slide 20, I don't know that I can associate kind of a correlation between that being a prospect for total costs, associating those total costs to that slide 17. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is could we be looking at a more precise way of predicting, and maybe precise isn't the right word, but maybe a better predicting agent of just looking at the size of post-interim reclamation and what I call long-term disturbance for those sites. And that way that could potentially help us quantify what the potential total future costs are for that reclamation. Does that make sense? AAG Minor, Dr. Arthur, I still see your pictures here. I know that was a very long-winded comment / question.
Who wants it?
Commissioner Gonzalez, can I start?
Yeah, please.
I think that one of the important data sets that the team did pull together that relates to your question is what is the actual disturbance that we're seeing, right? And I think that's where the slide that I pulled up now shows actual location sizes to the extent that we know them. And so understanding or, putting the right dollars with the right size and the right frequency seems to be the theme of your question to me. And again, as Joel walked through, we have close to 40,000 locations that are pre-2A. We estimate those to be small based on what we know about development patterns at the time. But that I think that the distribution that we see in the second column under locations with 2As may help frame the analysis more precisely. And as I think about it, I mean, we can watch. I think that helps answer the question. I don't know, Joel. I think I cut you off. If you want to jump in as well.
I think that was a great answer, Director Murphy. And all I would add is that the purpose of slide 20, Commissioner Gonzalez, is not to say all new locations are 10 acres and therefore the appropriate amount of financial assurance should be calculated for a 10-acre site. The purpose is to just show with the data we have available the trend that locations are growing over time, right? And not all new locations are large, many are, and what large means varies among sites and operators, but the purpose of that is not to sort of give a definitive acreage value for what we think new locations will be in the future, but just to illustrate that trend that location size is increasing over time.
And I appreciate that, AAG Minor, that trend is important to look at. And I think that potentially slide 19 or the slide 19 gives a better picture of what that trend and kind of average looks like. Because when I look at slide 20, I'm thinking, well, heck, if we took all 2As in process and 2As in the last 3 years, assume they're the same number, you got an average of 9 acres per well site. And when I look over here at slide 19, I'm seeing an average of well below 5 acres per well site. And so that's just kind of where I was trying to make that connection, because just kind of in the presentation, I don't know that I quite made that connection. So I appreciate Director Murphy's suggestion that this may be a more guiding data set or summary of data on how to potentially make that correlation for kind of the predictive way that we are going to be looking at financial assurances and the amount of money needed to meet those needs.
Other questions? All right, I'm not seeing further questions. Director Murphy, AAG Minor, Ms. Arthur, and to all the staff, again, thank you for this great presentation of a significant amount of information. We'll look forward to diving into that further. We'll put it on the website so that others can have access to it. And then we will combine this with the information that we will likely receive from industry within the next week or so. And continue in our efforts here. Director Murphy, did you want to close out on this in any manner? Did we want to go to the schedule at all? Or what are your thoughts at this point?
Sorry, I started closing screens out and couldn't find mute, of course. I think it's up to you if you want to take a look at the schedule again and think about it or talk about it. I can pull that back up if you want me to, hopefully successfully drive on the website to where all the data, where we're housing all of this data so that, and kind of give a preview of what that looks like. I can do that.
Why don't you do that, the latter part, and drive to that while we've got our 74 participants with us.
Sure. Okay,
Now I'm putting you on the spot to screen share a COGCC website. And all
oh man, makes me nervous every time, mostly because of my technical limitations. So hopefully everybody can see the COGCC homepage right now.
Yep.
Okay. So if we go to Senate Bill 19181, which summarizes all the work that we've done to implement this legislation, this very important legislation. Within that, there are the rulemakings, and within the different rulemakings we've already accomplished, financial assurance is the one that we're starting to embark upon. So if we click that, it brings up, forgive me, I'm going to move this a little bit so I can see the full screen. It pulls up all of the information. And so we have the resources section of this page. These first 5 items were added with staff's initial financial assurance presentation earlier this year, these 5 subsequent, or these last 5 items are the data we've put together for today's presentation. So let's see if, see how this goes for me, right? So if we pull down the active operator data, this is an enormous spreadsheet. And it lists, I think we have 700 registered operators in the state of Colorado, somewhere around there. Not all of them have wells, but it has data about all of them. As we scroll across, we can see bond information. Sorry, my screen's not working as well as I want it to right now. Well data, production data, and active well data. Again, this is a screenshot of data based on, I think, this spring. So we need to understand that our database will change, and this is probably outdated at this point in time, but it's good data to shape our conversation. So that's one of the pieces. That's the active operator data spreadsheet. And then the literature review that Joel walked through that goes in detail through those different pieces is available. And all of these items can be downloaded and manipulated. Well, the Excel spreadsheets can be manipulated by anybody who wants to work with them. The Excel spreadsheet for bond claims, this again walks through the specific bond claim that COGCC has taken, number of sites, number of wells, the order number. So if you want to know more about what led to that particular site being orphaned, the order would have some of that information, the total surety, the total plugging bond, and any other amounts that we may have collected that we can spend. So that's the bond claim information. The orphan well project list is here. And again, that goes through the different spending on the different programs, I think. And then the last piece is the stripper well data. And again, this is a snapshot of what our records would show as the number of stripper wells an operator has on that particular date. So again, I think these are tons of good resources. The last resource I would like to take us to, because I think it's an incredible one, again, starting at our homepage, if we go to regulation and the orphaned well program within the blue bar, there's just a lot about what we are doing, how we're doing it on orphan wells, project list, maps, backlog, reports, expenditures, and some about the program history. So I think it's just a really, really solid resource for folks who really want to dig in and know more about what's going on in the world of COGCC's orphan well program. With that, Chair, I should probably check in and make sure there aren't questions, but otherwise I'll pull back up the timeline and see if we want to talk about it at all.
Why don't we hold just a sec before we move to the timeline, looking to other commissioners if anyone has questions concerning this. That was a great dive and a very good informational piece for commissioners and for our stakeholders to see where they can access the information that is derivative of all the great work that was done today on the PowerPoint. So any questions on this from commissioners? All right, then let's turn to time frame before we wrap up.
Oops. Okay.
So if we have a May 19th sort of outstanding questions, check back in, that could give industry an opportunity to gather the data and answer the questions that we revealed today. From what I'm seeing from industry's response, it looks like they could probably get it together by the end of the next week, which gives us, you and staff, a little time to put it together for us on May 19th. Does that sound about right?
I think so. If I hear otherwise from the folks who signed up to participate, I'll let you all know, and we can adjust course, but we'll plan for the 19th.
Thoughts, comments, questions from commissioners? Okay, I'm not seeing any. I think conceptually all of this looks good from my end, one commissioner's input, and appreciate again all the great legwork by staff on this. I think just looking at the amount of information that has been compiled and is on the on our website shows the diligence of staff in getting this information together for us. Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can I just clarify what the expectation is on May 19th? And does that mean folks have an opportunity to provide us more information based on some of the still outstanding questions? Or is this, sorry, I just need some clarification of what the 19th looks like and how folks prepare for that.
So Commissioner McGowan, I was envisioning at a minimum that staff would follow up with the other states and some of their questions. And, you know, the industry folks who signed up to participate in the, had signed up to participate in the informational docket could come forward with additional information, written or oral, to present to you all and maybe answer questions. I think if you want more than that, or have that broadened out to anything else, or we're totally open to it. I did just get a ping that we should actually do this on the 26th. So hopefully that works for folks as well.
Okay.
So we'll plan for the 26th.
So
what's your question?
Go ahead.
Sorry. So I'm just trying to figure out, you know, we just have now released and put out there a lot of data, and probably various groups are going to be mining it and looking at it and might have an opinion about how to interpret or what they see in the data beyond just the operators. And so yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if folks have seen kind of the questions that the commission still has outstanding and things that we're wanting more information about. And just making sure that we're providing an opportunity. And I'm not sure what that looks like. And I don't think it needs to be as complicated or as what it looked like the first round, but just wanting to make sure that there's an opportunity for folks who have been participating. So sorry, I don't know, really haven't thought through what that looks like, but I just want to put that out there.
So Commissioner, a couple of thoughts. I mean, one, you know, I think all of the information we've been gathering will feed into the rulemaking process as well. And so that is an opportunity for anybody who wants to participate, whether through public comment, written comments, or party status, to digest this and provide it back to you. If you want to provide something more specific to the informational docket, I think we could probably solicit to see who wants to provide thoughts to you, and I'll need direction on, you know, oral versus written and kind of some parameters around that. But those are the paths that I see as available.
I would be curious to know what other commissioners think.
Thoughts from other commissioners? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I think what I think is that maybe the best path forward for some of that information, or if folks want to give us feedback on some of the data that has been provided, that you know, we're all available for one-on-one discussions, for written submittals or emails to us. I think that individually, I think there's plenty of opportunity for that. I think that there's plenty of opportunity as we get into the more formal pre-hearing process, as well as through the rulemaking process itself. Although I'm always encouraging folks to contact me individually, provide me whatever information they think is important. Having said that, I don't know as I'm opposed to having a formal written submission piece, but I know that there were some thoughts that through the last formal process that some people were hedging some of what they thought until they could actually see a draft set of rules in order to be able to react rather than be proactive in some of their thoughts. And so, you know, I'm wondering the advantage of just reaching out to us and having a conversation versus a formal submittal process.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Messner. I tend to agree. I think that there will be some of those opportunities with the stakeholder meetings as well as just our opportunities to chat with others. But I'm also not opposed to the idea of you know, having another session like that. Though I think maybe even for me at this point, I'm ready to see some draft, you know, even just straw dog type rules to see kind of what you know, how things are shaping up and then be able to react to that. So yeah, I think I'm good with that. The other thing that I just wanted to note is I just realized it doesn't really matter terribly, but I will be out of the office on May 26th. But I can always watch things on recording.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. I tend to agree with both of you. If folks desire to reach out relative to all the information, do it individually. I think we all have ready access to folks. I'm talking to people, I'm sure you guys are talking to people, and people that are interested in this, listen to this morning, they'll go and look at the website and can share thoughts, ideas, etc. And I think we should just keep this train moving at this point. Others with thoughts? All right, seeing.
Sorry,
Director Murphy?
Chair, do we want to try to find a non-Wednesday day to have this wrap up so that commissioners, all the commissioners can participate, like whether we did it Friday the 21st, for example, might be an option.
It's fine with me, and I think I'm seeing thumbs up from everybody else.
I was trying to see if, you know, what else we had scheduled that day. I don't see much, or it's not on my calendar. But maybe I'll work on that and try to get back and make sure that, you know, something works for all of us. But we could shoot for, you know, 9 a.m. on the 21st for now.
Looks like one commissioner may be on vacation that day. I'm looking at calendars correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the 20th?
Yeah, how about the 20th? Good.
Everybody thumbs up, 20th, 9 a.m.? All right, let's calendar that for the 20th on 9 a.m. The 19th is our commissioner hearing that's in the evening, and we would not be doing any study sessions, et cetera. That's merely for public comment. So returning the next morning for the special session would make a lot of sense.
Yep.
All right, I think we are done with that portion of our agenda this morning, and that takes us to commissioner comments. If commissioners have any comments for the good of the cause. I know I had spoken with Commissioner Hackett early, so I'm just going to pick on him to go first. I think he had some updates for us with regard to CDPHE.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. Yeah, did just want to share a couple of things, and I regret not sharing this information right after the public comments today. I was actually looking for the website link, but just wanted to share. I know a lot of folks are aware of the Air Pollution Control Division's ongoing efforts, the stakeholder process around minimizing emissions of greenhouse gases from the oil and gas industry, among other industrial sectors. And just wanted to remind folks, they've had a series of public listening sessions. Their next one is going to be next Tuesday on May 11th from 6 to 8 p.m. And the sign up for that, the registration, and as well as the strategies that are being considered so far, those can be found on the Air Pollution Control Division's website. And public comment priority will be given to members or representatives of disproportionately impacted communities. So just wanted to encourage folks to attend that if they're interested. Another thing I wanted to remind people of is starting on May 1st, new air quality monitoring requirements for the oil and gas industry have kicked in at the Air Pollution Control Division. Operators that begin drilling operations after that date, after May 1st, are required to submit air quality monitoring plans to the Air Pollution Control Division. And there's an opportunity for for local governments to provide comment on those. And just wanted to say that there are some plans or some locations that are subject to both an air quality monitoring requirement by the Air Pollution Control Division under Regulation number 7, as well as a permitting condition issued by the COGCC. So for those areas where there's overlap, our agencies have been working closely on those plans, and we've been listening to some of the feedback from COGCC staff on those plans. So just wanted to give a special thanks to COGCC staff for that. So if you're listening out there, Greg, John, Steve, and Rebecca, thank you so much for jumping in those plans so quickly and providing feedback. I know staff in the Air Pollution Control Division really appreciates that. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention, people might be interested in an update on the mobile van efforts. The Mark Martinez and Joey Irwin Memorial Public Projects Fund gave CDPHE funding for adding an additional mobile air monitoring van. And we're happy to report that we're currently, right now, we have a job opening for a new air quality monitoring scientist who would operate that van. If there are folks out there who are listening who are interested in applying, I understand that the application window will be closing shortly, so consider getting your applications in as soon as possible. And we're really excited about the potential for this new equipment. It's going to significantly expand our monitoring resources and hopefully, get us closer to meeting community expectations and getting out there more quickly and doing more monitoring. So wanted to provide that update, and thanks everyone for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Hackett. Other commissioners with comments? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I a couple of things. Number one, so I have got to change that on my cell phone. That is really annoying. Based on some of the comments that we heard in public comment today, I think I was hearing a number of folks wanting some kind of two-way communication. And so I'll reiterate that, and I think it's true for all of us. And I've said this a number of times during commissioner comments during the meetings. And I know that a lot of the folks that provided public comment are no longer in the meeting. So if your friends or acquaintances to them, please encourage them to do this as well. But please reach out to me individually as a commissioner. My email address is john.messner@state.co.us. I've got phone numbers available on the website. I'm always available for conversations and two-way communication. I've said this a number of times at public meetings and haven't heard from anyone that consistently provides public comment to us. And so I do encourage you to reach out and have a conversation with me. I'm happy to hear your concerns and have a dialogue with you. With that, and this will take just a second, but I did have someone reach out to me and ask specifically about what some of the rules that we have are around disproportionately impacted communities and some of the work that we did during the mission change rulemaking around disproportionately impacted communities. And so had an opportunity to go back and kind of review some of the specific things around disproportionately impacted communities that we modified during our our mission change rulemaking that went into effect on January 15th, 2021. And so I thought I'd just share that with everyone and put it out to the public as well, what some of the specific rules are around that. Again, the definition of disproportionately impacted communities that we adopted is found in our 100 series rules definitions, and the application of that definition is found in our 300 series rules, which are all available on our website. Specifically, Rule 303A5B IIDD is when an operator submits an oil and gas development plan, essentially a new permit for an oil and gas development, the operator must submit an evaluation of cumulative impacts, including incremental adverse impacts to public health due to oil and gas operations associated with OGDPs. Among other things, that analysis must identify whether the proposed OGDP includes oil and gas locations within a disproportionately impacted community. Rule 304B2BX requires operators to submit an alternative location analysis as part of an OGDP application if the proposed oil and gas location working pad surface is within 2,000 feet of buildings or schools located within a disproportionately impacted community. Rule 304B2CIFF requires one or more maps or recent aerial images showing all disproportionately impacted communities within 2,000 feet of each oil and gas location analyzed in the alternative location analysis. Rule 304B2CIIIBB requires operators to prepare a data table as part of an alternative location analysis for any location within a disproportionately impacted community that lists, number one, the distance to the nearest building unit and schools. Number two, a description of the community outreach efforts conducted by the operator prior to preparing the alternative location analysis, including whether the operator made information available in languages other than English based on the linguistic needs of the communities, questions and operator responses to the questions from residents of disproportionately impacted communities, and any public meetings conducted, including location, time of day, and whether interpreters were requested and provided with residents of the disproportionately impacted community. And number three, the number and description of existing oil and gas locations, oil and gas facilities, and wells also within 2,000 feet of any residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, or school facility within 2,000 feet of any proposed oil and gas location analyzed in the ALA. Rule 304B3A requires operators to include disproportionately impacted community boundaries and buildings within disproportionately impacted communities on cultural distance tables submitted as part of the OGDP application. Rule 304B7J requires an operator to submit a disproportionately impacted communities map as part of their OGDP application if the proposed oil and gas location is within 2,000 feet of a building unit or school facility within that DIC that showed the spatial relationship between the oil and gas location and the buildings identified and the boundaries of the census block group that meets the 100 series definitions of a disproportionately impacted community. Rule 304C20 would require a community outreach plan, consultation, outreach, and engagement for proposed oil and gas locations within 2,000 feet of a residential building unit, a high occupancy building unit, or school facility located within a disproportionately impacted community. This must include a description of any measures taken to directly mitigate adverse impacts to the disproportionately impacted community, certification that written materials have been and will be provided in all languages spoken by 5% or more of the population in the census block group where the proposed oil and gas location is located, and those census block groups within 2,000 feet of the proposed location, and that the proposed time, date, and location of any public meetings that are held at a location in close proximity that are to be held at a location in close proximity to the disproportionately impacted community. The operator will provide childcare and interpreted services at such a public meeting upon request. Finally, rules 303D1AI and 309A require a longer 45-day public comment period and 60-day consultation period for any proposed OGDPs within disproportionately impacted communities. So sorry to be long-winded there, but it was good for me to review those, and I think remind folks that this was an important part of our mission change rulemaking and is in fact part of our review process for oil and gas permits now moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. I think great reminder to everyone of the attention that we paid to that issue in our mission change rulemaking. Commissioner McGowan, you want to follow up Commissioner Messner? Go for it.
I don't know how I can beat that. So I'm gonna be a little personal today with people who were here this morning. You know, we all have lived experience and we all have things that have happened in our lives. And I am very appreciative of people who testify every morning with us when we have our hearings. And I appreciate their advocacy and their passion and where they're coming from. And I usually have a really thick skin about things like this, and I know that I'm being paid to sit here and to participate and to listen. For me personally, today is my first daughter's birthday, who passed away. She'd be 21 today. But I'm here because I'm committed to what we're trying to do here. And I'm hoping that people will understand that I'm a human being, and things like, I hope what you're doing will come back to you, and that you have blood on your hands are not things that I would ever say to somebody, even in a very passionate moment, even when I'm feeling very strong about something. I take my job really seriously here on the commission. I'm working as passionately as I can from the seat that I sit in to protect public health. I'm working really hard to try to reach out and meet people and work with them and to be solution oriented. I've been out to Erie a couple times, met some of the neighbors, have met the operator when I knew that there were noise complaints 2 weekends ago. I reached out to Mike Leonard to ask what he thought might be going on. I reached out to the operator to ask what he thought might be going on. I talked to Logic about how the neighbors were feeling. I care about what's happening. And I am hoping that we can work on how we communicate with each other, because there's a respectful way to do all of this, and to understand that we need to put things in perspective. So I'm sorry. It's been a tough morning for me, and I really care about this, but I really also would like people to understand that we all are coming from places too, and have things that have happened in our lives and have a lived experience. So I hope that makes sense. And I'm sorry to be emotional, but this was a really rough morning for me. So anyway, we're trying. I hope people know that we're trying. And I feel like we've done some good work here on the commission.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for the response that was needed, and for the heartfelt acknowledgement that we're humans and that we really are doing our best here. And those sorts of accusations don't assist in any of this. So thank you. And I agree. And I think my fellow commissioners agree as well. All right. Seeing no further comment, I look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.